The morning sun sliced through the linen curtains of Clara Whitmore's dining room, painting long rectangles of light across the oak floor. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and aging paper. She had dusted the mantel that morning, as always. Order soothed her, especially now, in the months after Robert's death. Clara, 52, moved with a grace that masked exhaustion. She had learned not to show weakness, not to her children, not to Robert's family, and certainly not to the men now circling her late husband's legacy like vultures. The envelope had arrived by courier. Thick paper. Embossed seal. She recognized the firm, Kessler and Hyde, her brother-in-law Frank's lawyers. Her hand trembled only slightly as she slit the envelope open with the brass opener Robert used to keep in his study. Inside was a single sheet. We regret to inform you that the Whitmore estate is now under formal review. A petition has been filed to determine your legal capacity to manage said estate. Clara sat down slowly. They're really doing it, she whispered. 2 months ago, she had stood by Robert's grave, numb. His heart had failed on a Tuesday morning, just as he'd been preparing to drive out to their lakeside property for inspections. No goodbyes. No time to prepare. Just silence. After 30 years of marriage, she had become fluent in the language of his silences, but this one was unbearable, and now Frank, the brother who hadn't called her since the funeral, wanted to take everything. Robert left in her care. Not just the properties. The legacy. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table. Mom, a soft voice called. It was Elise, her daughter, 27 and freshly returned home after a breakup in Chicago. You okay? Clara folded the letter neatly before Elise could see it. Just bills, she lied. Go back to sleep. But sleep was not something Clara would know again that day. She went to the study, Robert's sanctuary, lined with walnut shelves and leather-bound binders. Her husband had been meticulous. He built his real estate holdings from the ground up, starting with one rental house he managed himself. She remembered helping him scrub carpets in the winter of '97, in a duplex with broken heaters and broken dreams. There were 37 properties now, residential, commercial, rural plots waiting for development. Every deed, title, lease, and receipt was in this room. Because Robert trusted Clara. She had handled bookkeeping, tenant calls, even negotiating purchases when his health declined. The empire bore his name, but it had always been their life. Still, none of that mattered in court without evidence. And Frank, knowing how quiet Clara had always been, was betting she wouldn't fight. She picked up the phone. Her fingers hovered. Then dialed the number Robert had written on a yellow sticky note in the drawer. If I'm gone, call her. That was all it said. The line rang once. Twice. A calm, assertive voice answered. This is Delilah Ford. Miss Ford, Clara said. My name is Clara Whitmore. I need help. There was a pause. Then the voice softened. I've been expecting your call. Clara met Delilah Ford at a modest office tucked behind a florist and a pawn shop on the east side of town. The sign outside simply read Ford and Associates, its letters dulled by years of sun. Clara appreciated the lack of grandeur. She wasn't looking for theater. She was looking for someone who could understand a life built piece by piece, and now at risk of being stolen in a matter of days. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender and old files. Delilah was waiting in the reception area, dressed in a dark navy suit, sleeves rolled just slightly above her wrists, as if she'd been mid-task but paused to greet Clara herself. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, rising. Her handshake was firm. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Clara replied. Her voice was steady, but something about Delilah's presence made her chest ache. It was the first time in weeks someone looked at her not with pity, but with expectation, as if she still had fight left in her. Delilah led her to a small conference room, walls lined with framed legal diplomas and one large corkboard pinned with color-coded case notes. No desclater. No assistant hovering. Clara liked that. Tell me everything, Delilah said, opening a notebook. Start from the beginning. Clara hesitated, then began, halting at first, but gathering strength. She spoke of Robert, how they met in college, how he'd always had a head for numbers but hated offices, how they bought their first property with borrowed money and sweat. She told her about the late nights, tenant complaints, near evictions, broken pipes, and broken promises. About how Robert had trusted her with it all, especially as his heart condition worsened. And now, Clara said, pulling the letter from her purse, they're trying to say I'm not competent to manage it. Delilah read it slowly, then set it down. They're not accusing incompetence directly. They're requesting a review, subtle language, meant to plant doubt. But I've seen this before. They're angling for control. Of everything? Clara asked. Yes. If the court finds you incapable, they can appoint a fiduciary, or, worse, assign control to a family member. Frank Whitmore is listed as a petitioner. That usually means he's making a claim on behalf of the estate. But Robert left everything to me. Delilah nodded. Do you have the will? Yes. Clara pulled a folder from her bag. It was thick. Organized. Tabbed by color, Delilah flipped through the documents, her brow lifting slightly. This is meticulous work. I learned to keep records. Robert always said the difference between surviving and losing everything was proof. Delilah looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Whitmore, you're not just capable. You're the backbone of this portfolio. You have what most heirs dream of: documentation, clarity, and history. We're going to win this. But we'll need to go in strong. You'll be tested. Are you ready for that? Clara didn't answer immediately. She thought of the courtroom. Of Frank's smug smile. Of the judge's dismissive tone when he called to schedule the first hearing. Just a standard review, ma'am. Nothing to worry about. She thought of Elise, who still didn't know about the letter. Of the tenants who called her by name when she showed up to inspect a roof or patch a garden fence. I'm not a fighter, Clara said finally. But I loved my husband. And I won't let them erase what we built. Delilah's smile was almost imperceptible. That's all I needed to hear. She stood. The first hearing's in 3 weeks. Between now and then, we gather every title, every transaction, every line item. If it has your name or Robert's, I want it documented. And when we walk into that courtroom, they'll see exactly who they're dealing with. Clara stood too. Taller than she remembered being. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of grief remained, but something new stirred beneath it. Purpose. The garage was hot, the kind of stifling July heat that wrapped around Clara's neck like a wool scarf. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, marked in Robert's handwriting: Lakeside Lease 09, tenants, West End, receipts 2015 to 2016. It was an archive of their life, not curated for presentation, but crammed together in the efficient chaos Robert used to call organized clutter. Clara wiped her brow and pulled the first box down. A cloud of dust greeted her. Elise hovered in the doorway. You sure you don't want help? I'm sure. She hadn't told Elise the details yet. Not about Frank. Not about the court hearing. Not about the letter that had punctured her quiet grief like a jagged rock through a windshield. There would be time for that. Right now, she needed clarity, her own, and there was something sacred about facing this alone. Each folder she opened was a doorway: tenant complaints scribbled in pencil, contractor invoices with Robert's red ink notes, handwritten lease agreements from the early years when they couldn't afford lawyers. She found receipts from hardware stores, grocery bags used as makeshift envelopes, photographs paperclipped to inspection reports. Each piece felt like a whisper from her past, messy, real, unpretentious. Tucked in the corner of one box was a composition notebook. Clara opened it and found Robert's neat block lettering: property notes, for Clara, in case I'm not here. Her breath caught. She flipped the pages slowly. It wasn't a financial log or property guide. It was personal. Robert had documented decisions they made: why they didn't buy the lot on Oak Street, bad drainage; why he trusted Jim the roofer, he called when he was late, every time; why he believed in the strip mall investment even when it scared them. Clara saw the potential. I didn't at first. She was right. If I go first, don't let Frank near the paperwork. He's loud but lazy. He doesn't understand that being right isn't about speaking louder, it's about doing the work. Clara pressed her hand against the page, a tremor moving through her fingers. She read it all, then read it again. The evidence of her competence was already here, not just in receipts or titles, but in the legacy of trust. That evening, she organized everything into bankers' boxes. Titles, leases, purchase agreements, letters from tenants thanking them for fair treatment. Every paper had a story, and every story had Clara's fingerprint. At midnight, she called Delilah. I have everything, she said. Not just documents. A trail. A timeline. Even Robert's notes. There was a pause, then Delilah's voice: You did all that today? Yes. You just became the prosecution's worst nightmare. Clara didn't smile, but something inside her relaxed. She was no longer a widow sorting memories. She was a woman preparing her case. As she hung up, she glanced at the dining room table, now buried in sorted folders. The chandelier above it flickered faintly in the warm air. This wasn't just about proving her competence. It was about proving that legacy wasn't built on bravado. It was built on years of quiet work, of trust, of showing up. Frank Whitmore liked to think of himself as a practical man. Pragmatic. Straight shooting. The kind of person who told it like it is. At least, that's how he described himself at country club dinners, where the bourbon flowed and the talk turned toward family matters. But deep down, Frank didn't care much for process or patience. He liked control. The morning after his lawyer filed the petition against Clara, Frank sat on the back patio of his 5-bedroom ranch in Hamilton County, sipping black coffee from A mug that read "Number 1 Uncle." His second wife, Darlene, was already on her second Pilates video of the day, leaving him in peace to review the email from Kessler and Hyde. Initial hearing confirmed. Petition has been accepted by probate court. Opposing counsel, Delilah Ford. Frank grunted. He remembered Delilah, a no-nonsense, sharp-witted woman with a reputation for making loud men look small. She had once dismantled a zoning board's entire testimony using nothing but a series of dated emails and a smirk. A paper killer, someone once called her. Still, he wasn't worried. Not really. Clara doesn't have the stomach for this, he muttered aloud. He had underestimated her before, more than once, in fact. Quiet Clara, with her quiet voice and quiet presence. The one who always looked down at dinner when the men talked business. Who let Robert lead, never stepping in, never challenging. Frank knew Robert had left everything to her. But Robert had always been sentimental, too trusting. And grief made people vulnerable. That's what Frank was counting on. If Clara looked overwhelmed, uncertain, lost, well, the judge would notice. He just had to nudge the narrative. He called his lawyer, make sure the petition includes reference to her emotional state. Widowhood. Loss. Stress. Paint the picture. Without direct accusation, the lawyer asked, of course. We're concerned for her, not attacking her. We just want what's best for the estate. He hung up, satisfied. What Frank didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was Clara alone in her dining room that same morning, reviewing the county plat maps. Marking tax parcel numbers in pen, cross-referencing deeds with the master spreadsheet Delilah had sent her. She was working harder now than she had in the months before Robert died, focused, meticulous. That afternoon, Clara sat with Delilah at the firm. There's going to be character testimony, Delilah said, reading from the court notice. Frank's lawyer is requesting to bring in third parties to assess your emotional state. They'll frame it as concern, but it's a tactic. I expected it. Delilah glanced at her. Do you have anyone in your corner? A neighbor, business contact, someone who's seen you work firsthand? Clara nodded. Marcus Tillman. He manages our Eastside complex. He knows I've been the point of contact for years. And there's Rebecca Lou, she's a commercial tenant. I negotiated her lease personally. Perfect. We'll get affidavits. Clara took a breath. They're going to try to embarrass me, aren't they? Delilah didn't blink. They're going to try to erase you. Because it's easier to win if you disappear. Clara leaned forward. Then I won't give them that. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Clara's living room turned into a war room. Elise finally learned the full story, and to Clara's surprise, didn't shrink away. I'm with you, she said. Just tell me how to help. They stayed up late assembling binders. They shared stories about Robert, his quirks, his fierce belief in Clara's judgment, the time he let her sign off on a $200,000 property alone and never questioned her instinct, and on the eve of the hearing, Clara stood in front of the mirror, wearing a navy suit she hadn't touched since Robert's funeral. She looked at herself not with vanity, but calculation. Not a widow. Not a victim. A partner. A steward. A woman ready to take back what was hers. The courtroom wasn't what Clara expected. There were no grand chandeliers, no towering bookshelves or mahogany benches like in movies. Just beige walls, a tired ceiling fan, and rows of pew-like benches that smelled faintly of floor wax and apprehension. Clara sat at the petitioner's table beside Delilah, a thick binder open in front of her. Every tab, every highlighted page, every receipt was in its place. Her hands were still, though her chest felt like it housed 1,000 birds trying to escape. Across from her, Frank sat with his lawyer, a slick man named Drew Lennox whose suit looked like it had never seen the inside of a car with cloth seats. Frank looked smug, comfortable, legs crossed, nodding at familiar faces in the room. This was his terrain, or so he thought. The judge entered, a man in his early 60s, silver hair, wireframe glasses. He didn't look cruel, just exhausted. Another estate hearing in a long line of them. He scanned the case file and raised an eyebrow. Is this going to be complicated? He asked, mostly to himself. Then, louder, to Clara and Delilah, ma'am, sit down. This won't take long. Frank smiled. Clara's jaw tightened. Delilah rose. Your Honor, we believe the facts of this case warrant your full attention. What's at stake is not just property, but a legacy, and a reputation unfairly challenged. Noted, the judge said. Let's proceed. Frank's lawyer went first, launching into a well-rehearsed narrative. He spoke of Robert Whitmore's untimely passing, of the size and complexity of his estate, and of the concerning lack of oversight following his death. He emphasized Clara's emotional state. Repeated phrases like widowhood can impair judgment and not an indictment, but a concern. He used terms like well-intentioned mismanagement and overwhelmed by grief. Frank nodded solemnly, playing the part of the worried brother-in-law. When he finished, the judge looked to Delilah, Miss Ford. Delilah stood slowly, calm and grounded. Your Honor, what Mr. Lennox has presented is conjecture dressed as concern. What we intend to present is evidence. She turned to Clara. Please tell the court your role in the management of the Whitmore estate. Clara stood. Her voice was steady, though her pulse thundered in her ears. I've managed our properties for the last 14 years, she began. Robert was the face. I was the function. She described her responsibilities: handling tenants, negotiating leases, scheduling repairs, tracking payments, managing budgets. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Delilah handed the judge a binder. Your Honor, Exhibit A, full documentation of Mrs. Whitmore's management activities from 2010 to present. Signed leases, invoices, titles, tenant correspondence. All indexed and time-stamped. The judge flipped through a few pages. His demeanor shifted slightly. The weariness gave way to focus. Delilah continued. In addition, we submit a notarized affidavit from Marcus Tillman, property manager of the Eastside Complex, affirming that Mrs. Whitmore is the sole point of contact for all business matters. Also included, a letter from commercial tenant Rebecca Liu, describing Clara's handling of lease renegotiations last year. Frank leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something. The smugness faded, and finally, Delilah said, we have a personal property ledger left by Mr. Whitmore himself, detailing his trust in Clara's judgment, including warnings about potential interference by the petitioner. She placed Robert's notebook gently on the table. Silence followed. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, this is comprehensive. Clara nodded. Because I did the work. Frank's lawyer tried to recover, questioning her about one late tax payment from 3 years ago. Clara answered calmly, with documentation. A contractor dispute? She produced emails. A roof inspection delay? She cited weather reports and rescheduling confirmations. Every attempt to paint her as overwhelmed met a paper trail proving she was anything but. By the end of the session, the judge no longer looked tired. He looked intrigued. We'll reconvene next week for closing remarks, he said. But it's clear to the court that Mrs. Whitmore came prepared. Clara sat down, exhaling slowly. Delilah leaned in. You just flipped the room. And across the aisle, Frank no longer smiled. The courtroom had fallen silent, but the echo of Clara's voice lingered in her mind long after she left the building. Her words had been measured, her hands calm, but inside, the fire still burned. As she stepped into the summer sunlight, Elise was waiting with a thermos of cold water and a worried look. You were incredible, she said. Clara gave a faint smile. I was terrified. You didn't show it. You looked like you belonged there. That word, belonged, hung in the air for so long. Clara had been behind the scenes, behind Robert, behind the ledgers and the phone calls and the responsibilities no one ever praised. Now, the courtroom had seen her, heard her, believed her, but the day wasn't over. At home, Clara sat on the porch steps, watching the slow sway of the dogwood tree they'd planted 25 years ago. Elise brought out 2 cups of coffee. Why didn't you ever tell me you did so much? She asked. Clara sipped. Because it didn't feel like something you tell. It was just what needed to be done. Elise nodded slowly. I always thought Dad handled everything. He let you think that. A pause. Did that bother you? Clara looked out at the street. No. It protected me. But now I realize. Maybe it protected everyone else from seeing what I'm capable of. That night, in a tidy office on the other side of town, Frank wasn't sleeping. He paced, reading and rereading the transcript from court. She was calm, he muttered. Too calm. Drew Lennox had warned him not to underestimate Delilah, but he hadn't expected Clara to be the threat. We need to pivot, Drew said over the phone. The judge is leaning in her direction. We can feel it. Frank rubbed his temple. Then, we make it about money. We push the narrative that Robert would have wanted the assets managed with oversight. Find an angle. There's a cousin willing to testify. Someone Clara fired from the maintenance crew 2 years ago. He claims she was erratic. Says she made emotional decisions. Good, Frank snapped. Put him on the list. If we can't win with logic, we win with perception. Back at Clara's, Delilah sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and her usual poise. They're going to attack your character next. They're bringing in a disgruntled ex-employee. Clara sighed. Troy? Delilah nodded. You know him? I let him go after he showed up drunk to a tenant call. Do you have documentation? Yes. Written warning. Police report. Signed release. Delilah smiled. Then let them bring him. But Clara knew how public perception worked. One story, true or not, could derail months of truth. And while she wasn't afraid, she wasn't naive. They're not fighting to protect the estate, Clara said. They're fighting to erase me from it. Delilah closed her notebook. And failing. Still, the next few days were uneasy. Rumors began circulating in town. A whispered comment at the grocery store. A tenant asking cautiously if Clara was stepping back. Friends who didn't call back. Elise grew frustrated. They're smearing you. Clara touched her daughter's hand. Let them. The truth is louder. We just have to keep speaking it. Delilah prepared their counter-strategy. More affidavits. Financial charts showing year-over-year performance under Clara's management. A timeline of decisions she'd made. That improved property value, reduced vacancy rates, and increased revenue. But most importantly, testimony from tenants who felt seen, respected, and safe because Clara, not Robert, ran the show. One of them, a single mother named Lorena, called Clara personally. I heard what they're saying, she said. But I remember when you fixed our boiler in January, yourself, when no one else came. I remember. It wasn't just about the court case anymore. It was about visibility. About voice. About years of unseen labor finally casting a shadow strong enough to stand under. The courtroom was colder the second time, not in temperature, but in tone. The energy had shifted. Frank's team was no longer playing polite. This round was about credibility, and their opening move was character assassination. Drew Lennox stood confidently at the front, sleeves crisply pressed, voice smooth as silk dipped in vinegar. Your Honor, we'd like to call Troy Whitmore to the stand. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Elise, seated behind her, sat forward. In her chair. Delilah gave a short nod. We expected this. Troy entered with a half smirk, his blazer ill-fitting and eyes a touch too wide. He was Frank's nephew, and Robert's second cousin, a man who had worked under Clara briefly before getting dismissed. Please state your name in relation to the estate. Troy Whitmore. I used to do maintenance on several of the family's rental properties. Clara let me go 2 years ago. And why were you let go? Troy shifted, putting on a wounded expression. She said I was unreliable. But it was really about control. She didn't like that I asked questions. About how things were being managed. About how she was making big decisions without anyone else involved. Delilah rose. Objection, speculation. Sustained. The judge said without looking up, but the damage was intended, not technical. Drew leaned in. Troy, in your view, was Clara emotionally stable during that time? She seemed off. Like she was under pressure. She'd snap at people. She didn't always seem to understand the business side of things. Delilah was already on her feet before Drew could finish his next question. Your Honor, permission to cross. Granted. Delilah approached the stand like she was stepping onto a chessboard. Calm. Precise. Mr. Whitmore, is it true you were issued a written warning for showing up intoxicated on the job? Troy blinked. It was one time. And did that warning include a police report after a tenant called emergency services when you passed out in their utility room? There was a stir in the room. Troy shifted. That was exaggerated. Delilah held up a document. This is your signed acknowledgement of termination, including agreement that you would not dispute the grounds. He paused. I didn't think it would come up. Delilah nodded. It only came up because you chose to offer judgment on someone else's character. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, this witness's testimony is not only biased, it's retaliatory. His employment was terminated for cause, and all records support that decision. The judge made a note, clearly unmoved by Troy's performance. Delilah turned back once more. Mr. Whitmore, did Clara ever make a financial decision without supporting documentation? I don't know. Did you ever see her act inappropriately toward tenants, staff, or vendors? No, so your entire testimony is based on how you felt about being let go? Troy looked down. I guess. No. Further questions. Back at the table, Clara inhaled slowly. She hadn't wanted it to go that far, but watching Delilah dismantle the facade gave her something she hadn't expected. Relief. The court broke for lunch. Outside the courthouse, Frank pulled Drew aside. That didn't land. Drew frowned. She's hard to corner. It's not that she fights back, it's that everything she says is clean, verified, tracked. Judges love that. Clara sat quietly on a bench beneath a maple tree, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood beneath her. Elise handed her a sandwich, untouched. I don't want to be this version of myself forever, Clara said. What version? The one who's always fighting to be heard. Elise leaned in. Maybe this isn't the fight to be heard. Maybe it's the one that proves you already were. We just weren't listening. Later that day, Delilah presented 3 affidavits from property managers and tenants, all attesting to Clara's steady hand, respectful demeanor, and business acumen. Each was factual, unembellished, signed and notarized, and the judge began to see the pattern. A woman unseen for years, now undeniable. The courthouse smelled like old paper and coffee, again. But Clara had stopped noticing those details. She was focused now. Sharpened. Every time she walked through those heavy glass doors, she felt less like the woman who first received that letter from Frank's lawyers, and more like the one Robert had trusted to run everything when he was gone. This session was short, procedural. Closing arguments were just days away. But the judge had requested additional clarification on one item: the Lakeside subdivision, their biggest holding, 6 parcels of waterfront land now worth nearly 4 times their original value. Delilah stood confidently as she presented the full development file. Clara had organized every document: purchase records, permit filings, environmental reviews, even Robert's handwritten calculations from years ago. There was a story in those pages. Not just about money. About foresight. About trust. This subdivision was Clara's idea, Delilah told the court. She found the lots. She managed the rezoning process. Robert supported her, but she was the architect of this growth. The judge asked a few quiet questions. Then he looked at Clara directly. Why didn't you add your name to the deeds? Clara paused. Because I didn't need to. Robert and I didn't separate our work into ownership. We separated it by strength. He had vision. I had execution. Frank shifted uncomfortably. After the hearing, Clara and Delilah sat quietly in the courthouse cafe. Neither drank their coffee. You've done everything right, Delilah said. Every attack they've launched, you've answered. But the final impression will be emotional, not just legal. The judge needs to see the whole person. Clara nodded. Then I want to speak. Delilah blinked. Testify? I want him to hear it from me. What this really is. Delilah studied her. You've earned that. That night, Clara opened the last unopened box in the garage. It was labeled Robert, notes not filed. Inside were loose pages, scribbled calculations, and a yellowing folder marked simply, to be updated. Inside, she found a single-page memo. Dated 6 months before his death. Add Clara's name to titles for parcels 14B, 18C. She's done the work. I've just signed the papers. Her hands trembled. It hadn't been updated. He hadn't lived long enough. But the intention was clear. Written. Time-stamped. She called Delilah. We found it, she said. The note about the titles. Delilah sounded almost reverent. Bring it tomorrow. This changes the tone. The next day, Delilah filed it as a supplemental exhibit. Not legal proof of ownership, but something deeper, evidence of intention. The judge read it twice, then folded it carefully. Back home, Elise sat at the table, scanning social media for gossip, rumors, support. The whispers were shifting. Tenants and vendors were posting about Clara. Messages of respect. Stories of small kindnesses. Fixing a heater in winter. Waiving late fees during the pandemic. A landlord who remembered names, birthdays, and once drove 3 counties over to deliver a replacement key to a stranded tenant. They were seeing her now, not just as Robert's widow, but as Clara Whitmore. The force behind the foundation. The courtroom was packed, more than usual. Word had gotten around, about the widow who didn't crumble, the lawyer who wouldn't flinch, the estate that had become more than just land and money. It had become a question of truth, of legacy, of visibility. Clara wore navy again. The same suit from the first hearing. It wasn't luck. It was armor. The judge called for closing remarks, but before Delilah could rise, Clara stood. Your Honor, she said calmly. I'd like to testify. The judge raised an eyebrow. You've already submitted extensive documentation, Mrs. Whitmore. I know. But this is personal. There was a pause. A brief glance between the attorneys. Proceed, he said. Clara walked to the stand. Her steps were slow, steady. She took the oath. Saturday. Looked directly at the judge, not defiantly, but without apology. My husband and I built something together, she began. Not just a business. A way of life. We started with 1 house, a broken pipe, and $23 left in the bank. I took the tenant calls. I fixed the drywall. I filled out the permits. He negotiated the sales, but I managed the chaos. He was the foundation. I was the frame. She paused. When he got sick, he gave me everything. Not just in writing, but in trust. He knew I could handle it. And I did. Delilah placed the yellowed memo on the evidence table, the one Robert had written. Add Clara's name. The judge picked it up again. Clara continued. I didn't add my name to the titles. Not because I didn't care, but because we didn't divide credit that way. We shared everything. Until now, when I'm being told I'm not enough on paper to prove. I was there in reality. She turned slightly, looking at Frank. I understand why you're afraid. Because if I stand here, and I'm recognized for what I've done, then your version of history changes. And maybe you lose control. But what I'm asking for isn't control. It's recognition. Not as Robert's widow. As his partner. The room was still. Frank shifted, clearly uncomfortable. His lawyer didn't object. There was nothing to object to. Clara faced the judge again. I am not overwhelmed. I am not incapable. I am not broken by grief. I have spent every day since Robert died proving that not just to you, but to myself. I didn't want to be here. But I will not let someone rewrite the story we lived. Not while I'm still standing. Delilah stood beside her, silent, hands clasped. There was nothing more to say. The judge leaned back. I've heard enough. He didn't dismiss them. He didn't adjourn. He just sat for a moment, eyes closed, as if absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. Then he looked at Frank. Mr. Whitmore, you may want to reconsider your position before this court issues its ruling. Because what I see here is not a woman in over her head, but the clearest steward of this estate. The gavel didn't fall, not yet, but Clara had already won something deeper. As she stepped down from the stand, a few tenants stood in the back row. One gave a small nod. Another pressed a hand to her heart. They weren't just witnesses, they were proof. The courtroom buzzed quietly after Clara's testimony, like a shaken hive trying to reorganize. Even Frank's lawyer seemed subdued, no longer eager to press arguments that no longer stuck. The judge had recessed until Monday, promising a final ruling after a thorough review of all documentation and testimony. It was Friday. 2 days left. That afternoon, as Clara returned to her home, her sanctuary turned headquarters, she found a letter slipped under the door. No envelope. Just a single sheet. Clara, we need to talk. Not in court. Just you and me. I'll be at the diner on Route 6 at 6 p.m. Come alone. Frank. Delilah advised against it. He's rattled. He may want to bargain. That means he's losing. But Clara was curious. She wasn't the same woman who feared confrontation. And she didn't want to win a war she didn't understand. At exactly 6 p.m., she walked into the diner, the door chime slicing through the sound of clinking cutlery and low conversation. Frank was already there, in a booth, tie loosened, 2 coffees on the table. Clara, he said, standing awkwardly. You look prepared, she offered, sliding into the seat. He nodded. Yeah, that. They sat in silence for a moment. I didn't think you had this in you, Frank said. All these years, you were just in the background. I was never in the background, Frank. You just never looked closely. He didn't argue. I came to make an offer, he said. You walk away from the estate. Let a third party manage it. We'll give you a monthly stipend. Comfortable. Secure. No litigation. No risk. Clara blinked. You're offering me an allowance for my own work? It's cleaner than a court fight. You've made your point. Everyone knows now you were involved. Do you really need to run it all? She took a sip of her coffee. It was bitter. I don't need to, she said. But I want to. Because no one protected that work like I did. Not you. Not Robert's name. Not the court. Frank sighed. It's not personal. But it is, Clara said softly. Because you never tried to protect the estate. You tried to control the narrative. And you lost. He looked down. I just thought, maybe you'd take the easier path. I did that once, she said. Letting you all think Robert ran everything. Letting people think I was just the quiet wife. But I won't be invisible again. She stood. Keep your stipend. Frank watched her walk out, a flicker of something crossing his face, regret, maybe. Or awe. Or both. Back at home, Elise was waiting on the porch. How'd it go? Clara smiled faintly. He tried to buy me off. And I said no. They sat side by side in silence. You nervous about Monday? Elise asked. Yes, Clara said. But not like before. Why? Clara looked out at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to dip below the rooftops. Because now I know who I am, even if the court doesn't. And for the first time since Robert died, that felt like enough. Monday dawned slow and gray, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Clara dressed with deliberate care, navy again, her signature color now. Not for superstition, but for continuity. She wasn't reinventing herself. She was simply revealing who she had always been. At the courthouse, the room was full again. A quiet crowd, tenants, friends, former vendors, even a few who had once doubted her. Elise sat behind her, phone off, eyes forward. Delilah, as always, calm and unreadable. Across the aisle, Frank sat stiffly. His lawyer no longer whispered strategies or smiled at court staff. The momentum had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The judge entered without fanfare, sat, and opened the file in front of him. I've reviewed the testimony. documents, and exhibits submitted over the course of these hearings, he began. What I've seen is not just a record of business activity, but a portrait of a life's work, shared across decades. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitmore, you've demonstrated, beyond administrative expectations, that you are both capable and fully informed on the management of this estate. More importantly, you've demonstrated the intent of the deceased, your late husband, to entrust you fully with that responsibility. Frank shifted in his seat. While the petition from Mr. Whitmore raised procedural concerns, it did not present sufficient evidence to override the explicit and documented management structure left behind. The court therefore rules that Clara Whitmore shall retain full control of the Whitmore estate, with no need for oversight or third-party intervention. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Frank's mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. His lawyer patted his arm, but the gesture looked hollow. Performative. Empty. Delilah smiled, just barely, and leaned toward Clara. It's over. But Clara didn't smile back. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, the faces. She wasn't thinking about victory. She was thinking about work, because now the real work began. As the room cleared, Frank approached slowly. I meant what I said at the diner, he said. About it not being personal. Clara nodded. That's the problem, Frank. You never made it personal. But I did. I always did. That's why it survived. He left without another word. Outside, the sun had finally pushed through the clouds. Elise threw her arms around Clara. You did it. Clara hugged her back. We did. She turned to Delilah. Thank you. Delilah offered her hand. You didn't need saving. You just needed someone to make the room listen. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Clara felt no triumph. Only a deep, full breath. Like she hadn't taken one in months. Or years. It wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. It was about being heard, and finally, she had been. 6 weeks after the verdict, the air had changed. It wasn't just the weather, though summer had quietly begun its retreat. It was the rhythm of life. The silence around Clara was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. The mailbox no longer delivered legal threats. Tenants stopped asking if someone else would be managing their homes. Clara had resumed the routine she had built over decades: site visits on Tuesdays, repair logs reviewed on Thursdays, and lease renewals every first Friday. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't doing this in the shadows. People called her by name now. Not just Mrs. Whitmore. Not just the landlord. But Clara. There was respect in their voices. Recognition. Tenants waved when she visited. Vendors took her calls without hesitation. A few reporters even requested interviews. She declined them all. She didn't want to be a story, she wanted to work. One afternoon, she stood in front of the Lakeside Properties, the subdivision she had once drawn on paper, nervous and hopeful. The lots were nearly ready. Permits finalized. Infrastructure prepped. Robert had called it her moonshot idea. It was no longer a dream. Elise pulled up beside her, stepping out of her car in flats and a clean-lined blazer. She had recently accepted Clara's offer to manage digital operations, leases, online payments, tenant communications. A new generation taking root. You sure about this one? Elise asked, nodding toward a contractor truck unloading supplies. Clara smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. They walked the perimeter together, clipboard in hand, just like Clara used to do with Robert. Only this time, the partnership looked different. Not husband and wife, but mother and daughter, two women carrying a legacy forward. Do you miss him more now? Elise asked. Clara paused. I don't know if I miss him more. I think I just understand him better. How so? He never explained why he left it all to me. Not in words. But in action? In documentation? In that little yellow memo? She laughed gently. He knew I'd need more than a will. I'd need confidence. They sat on a bench that faced the water. The sun reflected off the ripples, just enough to warm her face. So what's next? Elise asked. I keep going, Clara said. I build. I manage. I teach you everything I know. And one day, if you ever need someone to believe in your instincts, I'll do what your father did for me. I'll leave it all in your hands. Elise rested her head on Clara's shoulder. No court hearing needed. No court hearing needed. That evening, Clara returned to the garage, now meticulously cleaned and labeled. The last file was finally closed. Every binder shelved. The memo from Robert, now framed, hung above the workbench. At Clara's name, she smiled that he didn't need to. She had already written her name into every lease, every transaction, every late-night phone call, every hard decision, every quiet act of perseverance. The estate bore his name, but the legacy, that was hers.